Hey guys, this is Bible lesson 18. Who doesn't like a good plot? We're going to try PowerPoint. Excuse me. We're going to try PowerPoint and see how that goes for this lesson. And yeah, so anything that comes up on the screen, that is what you want to write down on your paper, obviously, just like we were taking notes in a class. So everything that comes up on the PowerPoint is just like what I would be writing on the chalkboard. Um, yeah, so follow along closely and make sure you get everything. I believe we actually had started this lesson before before I went on quarantine before Thanksgiving. So anyway, you may have some of these notes. I don't think we got very far, but I think we did start on it. So you may have some of these notes already. That's okay. Just follow along, and then when you get to the point where you don't have them, just go ahead and keep filling them in and go ahead and finish the lesson. So, yeah, lesson 18. So we started by talking about the plot, and this comes from chapter 4 in the book What is Biblical Theology. You were supposed to have read that chapter. And we were talking about the plot of the story, the plot of God's big, grand, redemptive story that He gives us, and how important story is to the world in general, right? God made us to be people who enjoy stories, who like stories. And we have stories all around us. We have all kinds of storytelling mechanisms in our world. And we love stories. Now, unfortunately, some of those stories can be very repetitious and easily predicted and so on and so forth, but really good stories are stories that have these deep, really skillfully woven plots that are harder to predict and harder to understand, where not everything always turns out perfectly, right? And so on and so forth. And so, but what is God's story, and what is the plot that He lays out for us? Because it's kind of amazing how so many of the stories that man writes have a lot of the same aspects of God's story. So anyway, the plot of the story, and of course every good story has to have a conflict. There's this, there's the antagonist and the protagonist. There's these two opposing forces that are seeking to outdo the other. One is going to come out on top. One is going to win in the end. What are those two opposing forces in God's story? Well, of course, you have the prince of the power of the air, and who is the antagonist, right? The enemy. And then you have the Lord of the universe and His children. So God, His people, versus Satan, right? That's the kind of the overall gist of the conflict. The Lord of the universe and His children versus the prince of the power of the air. Now, as we talked about it before, there's a sense in which this isn't a very evenly matched conflict. God is going to win, and it's not even close. However, Satan has this uncanny ability of making it look like he's going to win. And that's kind of where the conflict and the plot takes this sort of sinister turn in our world, because there are millions and millions of people who are convinced by the prince of the power of the air that he is a better, that his side is the better side to choose. Now, they're badly deceived, of course, but that's what he's a master of convincing people of that. And so that's but that's the conflict that's going on. And we as children of God, We have an enemy, and we have to remember that. We also talked about how there's this mysterious wisdom that God has put in place that really um, that really kind of keeps coming to the surface over and over again. And one of the things that surprises us throughout God's story is how often He chooses people who you would least expect. He chooses the guy who's weak, who doesn't have the qualities that we would think would make the kind of person that God needs for whatever particular job He's calling him to. So, for instance, He calls Moses, who, before Moses became the leader of the children of Israel, he was really kind of cowardly. He absolutely hated speaking in front of people, right? He claimed, and that was his big excuse, right? He couldn't speak in front of crowds, and so he claimed that he was not going to be able to do what God called him to do, and God was like, "No, sorry, I'm gonna make it possible for you to do this. Am I not the one who created your mouth?" I think was God's response to him. If I made you, I can give you the ability to do what I need you to do. Now, He did provide Aaron to help him with that as well. But yeah, he chose this. The point is, he chose this man who, we didn't have personal interaction with Moses before he became the leader of the children of Israel. But I think if we would have, we would not have seen him as a potential strong leadership type of guy that it would seem would be needed and necessary to lead the children of Israel. But God chose him and He used him. When God decided to make a great nation, He chose Abraham and Sarah. And what's significant about Sarah? She was barren. So if you're gonna choose somebody to be the what's the word I want? If you're gonna choose somebody to start this great nation, why would you choose somebody who doesn't have the ability to have children when that's the one thing you need, right? So He chooses them and gives them the ability, gives Sarah the ability to have children. You just have this theme that keeps emerging. He chooses when Samuel goes to Jesse to choose a king. God takes him to Jesse to choose a king. Which son is the one that God chooses? It's the only son that Jesse thinks is so unworthy of being the king that he doesn't even call him in from the flocks. He brings all his other sons in because he thinks they all have a shot. But the one son who he thinks, it's not even worth it, not even worth calling him in, that's the one God chooses. Okay? King David. Again, on and on. Just times when people who you least expect become the ones who God chooses and God uses. Another thing that we talked about is how often it seems throughout this story it would appear, it would seem to indicate that Satan has the upper hand, that Satan is winning, and then all of a sudden he loses. It kind of happens over and over again. So right at the beginning of Genesis, you have Cain and Abel, and Abel is the good guy, right? He's the righteous one, and Cain is the bad guy. And what happens? Cain murders Abel. The good guy gets killed. And this kind of continues throughout. The wicked Israelites reject Moses. Moses, the one God chooses to use to deliver His people, and yet His own people kind of turn against Him on numerous occasions. David is this chosen king, and he's persecuted by Saul, the wicked king. And again, this kind of culminates. Well, you have other examples like the prophets. God sends the prophets to be the ones who give his message to his people. And what happens? They're hated and despised and rejected. And then this ultimately culminates in the Jewish leaders, the religious leaders themselves, killing Jesus, who is the promised Messiah. And then, of course, after that, you have the apostles who are martyred, all of them except for the apostle John. The men who Jesus chose to be his men, his followers, to spread his message throughout the world. They're all martyred for their beliefs. So it's just constant opposition and this constant what's the sense of Satan seems to be winning. He seems like he has the upper hand, and all of a sudden, bam, he loses. That's a recurring theme. So, in the face of what appears to be the triumph of the wicked, all the weakness and folly of love, humility, and joy and hope show the power and wisdom of a true and loving God. So the wisdom of God, these things that would appear to be foolishness to men, things that seem weak, things that seem hard to, things that by our standards, the world standards, the things that we see as not being powerful and effective, things that would seem to be weak, are the things that God uses to conquer. The wisdom of God, which appears as foolishness to the world, is superior to and triumphs over the formidable power of darkness. So love trumps hate, humility defeats pride, forgiveness destroys anger, joy overcomes hardship, and hope strengthens despite overwhelming opposition. This happens repeatedly. Joseph is kidnapped by his brothers, sold and imprisoned. Moses goes up against the Egyptians. Gideon versus the Midianites. David against Goliath. And then the nation of Israel defeated and scattered, and they finally come back, but they're this beaten, broken, battered version of their former selves. And then you have this long period of hundreds of years of silence before Jesus comes. So it's just this constant theme of difficulty and darkness before the hope kind of breaks through, and God wins. So then you have Jesus coming, right? You have the hope, the Messiah coming, and not everybody recognized him, but there were some people that I think were hopeful. They saw him and they think, I hope he's the Messiah. Now there were a few that really believed, like Simeon, some that were really convinced, but it wasn't many. But I think there were some that were like, yes, I think this is it. But they were maybe waiting to make sure. And then what happens? He is crucified. He's executed. And that probably felt like this massive blow to the people that were hoping that he was the one. And it again just seems like Satan wins. And I think at this point Satan was convinced that he had won. He thought that if he kills the Son of God, that's the greatest thing he could do, right? That should be his greatest victory. In a sense, you might say it was his greatest victory, but it was also his greatest defeat, right? So in the moment when he won his greatest battle, he also lost in the most incredible way possible. Okay. Anyway, so that's conflict, plot. Then let's talk some about the episodes. So some episodes that kind of emerge from the Bible, especially, and these are mostly from the Old Testament. You have exile from Eden, so kind of this idea of paradise lost, right? God giving his people so much, lavishing them with good gifts and so forth. But because of their rejection of him, they're exiled. Then you have the Exodus from Egypt, which is a paradigm of salvation. And I just noticed that I spelled Exodus wrong. Sorry about that. I hope you know how to spell that correctly. But anyway, so the Exodus from Egypt is this deliverance from sin, deliverance from the bondage of the enemy, right? And then you have exile from the land. So this is reminiscent of the exile from Eden. So God gives the children of Israel their promised land, but because of their disobedience, they're also exiled from there and put out and scattered amongst the nations. Then you have the cross and deliverance. So this kind of pattern of exile, deliverance, exile, deliverance. And then, of course, after the cross, you have resurrection, new life, redemption, and Jesus validating himself as the Messiah. So Jesus is the new Adam whose obedience overcomes Adam's sin. He redeems us from the curse by becoming the curse. You have this proclamation of this return from exile before Jesus comes. And who's the man who proclaims this soon return out of exile? It's John the Baptist, right? He's proclaiming that there's going to be deliverance and salvation. There's so many patterns that are kind of repeated throughout all this. So Jesus is harassed by Herod the same way that Moses was threatened by Pharaoh in the Old Testament. And Jesus' parents had to flee to Egypt for a while. And then he came back from Egypt, just like the children of Israel were called out of Egypt. Jesus was tempted in the wilderness, just as the children of Israel spent 40 years wandering in the wilderness and being tested. Jesus is hailed as a lamb. So this is reminiscent of the Passover when the Passover lamb was sacrificed that night when the angel of death came over. And the children of Israel were put into exile, cursed into exile, you might say. And in the same way, Jesus went to the cross completely, totally alone. So yeah, all these themes, all these patterns emerging. He takes the judgment that rightfully belongs to Adam and his descendants, and he's raised from the dead to bring that restoration, to deliver us and to bring us out of the exile. Okay? And lastly, of course, is his promised return. He's going to come back in power and glory. The slain lamb will become the ruling lion. The humble servant will become the King of Kings. The last will be first. He's going to come as he left. All his enemies will be destroyed, and Christ will reign. Lastly, let's talk some about theme, which is salvation through judgment. This is the theme that just constantly emerges from the scriptures. Salvation, of course, we talk about that a lot, but one thing we don't often associate with salvation is judgment. But salvation is always accompanied by judgment. Now, judgment is kind of a dark, difficult thing to talk about. However, it's a necessary element of salvation. It always goes along with it. It's hard, but it always comes with the sweet tones of future or present deliverance or salvation. So you think about the judgment on Adam and Eve. When God pronounced that judgment on them, he also gave them this promise that the head of the serpent would be crushed. Or how about during the Passover when the children of Israel were delivered from Egypt. What happened that night? Who bore the judgment? You could say the lamb, right? The Passover lamb and the firstborn of Pharaoh and the people of Egypt. There's this constant theme of salvation through judgment. Jesus ultimately is judged in our place. He takes the sin of the world on his shoulders, and he's judged in our place. When Jesus comes again, he will save his people, and then he will judge the serpent and the seed of the serpent. So there's this element of there's always this necessary judgment that goes along with salvation. Without judgment, there is not salvation. There's no need for forgiveness, redemption, or deliverance. So the constant theme of salvation through judgment. And then all of this, the episodes, the plot, all of these things in Scripture all have this kind of one common theme, and that is to display God's immeasurable glory. God is being glorified through the story that he is writing in the world. Okay, everything that he's doing is for the display of his glory. And that's what we need to keep in mind as we study biblical theology, as we study the story that God is writing in the world. We are important players in the world, but we are not even close to being the most important. Everything is about the glory of God. So our lives ultimately should be lived with that goal in mind, that we are promoting and prescribing, or I should say ascribing, glory to God. Okay. For homework, read Judges 13. We're starting into the story of Samson, one of the most common and also most interesting stories in the book of Judges. Takes up several chapters. I think it's the longest story in the book of Judges. A very, very interesting, fascinating story that has all kinds of plot twists, unexpected things, and it kind of ends very tragically. It's kind of this typical, almost like a Shakespearean tragedy, right? Anyway, so we're going to look at the story of Samson. Okay, guys. Hope you guys are doing well. Work hard today. Make Mr. Roth's job as easy as possible. Talk to you later.